It is 8 o'clock. Good evening, everyone. I'm Brad Smith, and I would like to welcome you to the first session of the 76th season of the Amos Fortune Forum. It is very warm this evening, so I promise, I'll keep my remarks brief, including a few housekeeping issues and items. At the doors and on your seats, you will find some small cards. We've put cards on the seats for years. This year, we redesigned them. Hopefully, it's a little simpler and more appealing to fill out. You're welcome to fill them out here. We'd love to get your contact information and put you on our mailing list and stay in contact with you. If you'd like, we also now have a QR code. You can just put your phone up to it and it will take you to our website. You can learn more about our calendar for the summer, about our speakers. You can certainly donate there. And you can give us some feedback and, again, give us your contact information if you would like to. There's also the traditional begging bowls at both of the doors. And that reminds me, I would like to take this moment to thank our corporate sponsors for the year. You may have seen some of their logos on the slides on the screen. And if you happen to see anyone from those companies, please thank them. It really makes a big difference for the Amos Fortune Forum, as well as all of the individual contributions that we receive throughout the year. We really appreciate it. Since 1946, this forum has been free and open to all, and we plan on keeping it that way. I'd also like to thank Susan Sarles for the flowers this evening, the beautiful bouquet of flowers, and thank Betsy Trimble and Jenda Trimble for hosting the reception following tonight's presentation. We hope you'll join us to meet with the speaker and enjoy some light refreshments. It may be dark at that point, so as you exit the door, be careful. You'll see the lanterns to take you across the street to the reception area, and we hope you'll join us. We're also this year setting up chairs outside. Tonight might be a good night to be out in the breeze, but if you'd like to come early with a picnic, you're more than welcome to do that. We will be broadcasting the presentations out the back of the meeting house, so you can listen from out there if you would prefer. So, with that, it is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Andy Card. Andy may be most known for that iconic image informing President George W. Bush that the United States was under attack on 9/11 while the president was reading to elementary school children in Sarasota, Florida. That was the most sobering day I've ever experienced, and I can only imagine what it was like for the Chief of Staff. As deep the responsibility was to serve so closely under the president during that time, it was part of a larger and longer dedication to serve across politics, academia, and business. To name just a few of his achievements, he has served at the highest levels under 3 presidents, including Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush. He was in George H.W. Bush's cabinet, serving in the position of Secretary of Transportation. He also was Deputy Chief of Staff. He coordinated the Republican National Convention in Philadelphia in 2000. He coordinated the administration's disaster relief efforts in the wake of Hurricane Andrew. He was Chief of Staff under George W. Bush, as I mentioned. I can only imagine how demanding and complex that role is, and he was the second longest-serving Chief of Staff in U.S. history. In 2011, He was named acting dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M, so he's an Aggie. He was selected as the 5th president of Franklin Pierce University in nearby Rindge. In 2018, he became chairman of the National Endowment for Democracy. He served on the board of directors of Union Pacific. He currently serves on the boards of a number of for-profit and nonprofit organizations, including, I think previously, the Chamber of Commerce. And earlier in his career, he was Vice President, Government Relations for General Motors Corporation. And importantly, he served in the U.S. Navy from 1965 to 1967. So, while many of you may know Andy and his wife Kathleen as neighbors here in quiet Jaffrey Center, his life has been anything but quiet. He has seen firsthand how government works and how sometimes it doesn't work, how we are constantly striving for a more perfect union. He has had an impact on presidents and their ability to move their agendas forward, on students full of promise and ambition, on corporations both large and small, and I'm certain on the local institutions under which we enjoy such an attractive way of life here. Though I've just scratched the surface of Andy Card's story and his contributions to our town and our state and our country, it is my honor and my privilege to introduce you to Andy Card.
I will say howdy. And I'm grateful for your attendance here. This is a special place. And the Amos Fortune Forum is a very special event. Amos Fortune was a remarkable person who gave definition to this town and gave us a conscience. And so I am grateful that you are here to hear me, but I'm really here to say thank you for taking the conscience that Amos Fortune gave us and doing something with it, because he proved to be inclusive, contributing, and leaving a legacy. And I think we are grateful in Jaffrey that he did that. You've also got the old burial ground out there. And Amos Fortune is resting there with his wife, Violet. But there are others who are resting there who give great definition. Some actually fought in the Battle of Bunker Hill. Some went to Ticonderoga. Some went to the Whiskey Rebellion. Some went to Germany. Some went to France. Some went to Italy. A woman wrote books and is with her forever partner. It's a special burial ground. This is a special place, and I'm grateful to be here. New Hampshire is a special state. I know that most of you do not consider the word politics to be a good word. And I doubt that any of you will acknowledge that it's noble to be a politician. I'm going to challenge you on both. We are remarkable in Jaffrey to be in New Hampshire, where politics has played such a base role in every aspect of your life. The most politically active state in the Union happens to be New Hampshire. That's because the government is very close to you. Very close to you. In fact, for some of you, it's you. It's your neighbor. And sometimes your neighbor says, give it up. Or sometimes you say to them, give it up. But politics is very close for you. And government closest to the people has the most empathy in all of government. So New Hampshire's definition of democracy, I think, is pretty remarkable. But the claim to fame that is being challenged this year as we get ready for election cycle is the first-in-the-nation primary. So I know, I ran campaigns in New Hampshire. I know what the first-in-the-nation primary means and how much is invested in it and how much gets invested into New Hampshire because of it. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information. How many of you know who Winston Churchill is? How many of you think that Winston Churchill had anything to do with the first-in-the-nation primary? You're all wrong. Winston Churchill actually gave us the first-in-the-nation primary. He gave us primaries. But it's not the Winston Churchill you're thinking about. He was a New Hampshire resident in 1906, and he was considered to be a progressive. He supported women's suffrage. He supported education. He didn't like backroom deals among the politicians. And he actually said, I'm going to do something about it. And he ran for state representative in New Hampshire. That is a thankless job with a tremendous paycheck. But Winston Churchill actually developed a friendship with some big names. The name Bass mean anything to you? There was a Governor Bass right from Peterborough. And he got to know those people. And he said, you know, the way you have elections right now isn't the right way to do it. You want to let us vote for the candidates, not just for the people who will meet in a group and pick a winner. I think you should have direct elections where we get to vote for candidates. And it was very controversial. But Governor Bass actually said, I think I agree with him. And he's going to say, let's make sure that we're not just voting for people who to go to a meeting to pick a candidate. Instead, let us vote for the candidate we want. And it took a lot of uphill work. Not like climbing Mount Monadnock, more like climbing Mount Washington. But eventually, in 2016, they got together and they said, we're going to start having direct elections so that we're electing people to positions rather than just electing other people to pick people in position. And we're going to elect people that will actually be delegates to a Republican convention or a Democratic convention rather than pick somebody that will be delegates to conventions. And so they changed the law, and they allowed the citizens of New Hampshire to actually be able to vote for the real potential office holders. And those were the seeds of the early days. But even then it was tricky because you were really voting for committee members to go to the conventions. And you weren't voting for the actual candidate at the convention. And so what didn't come until 1948, that Winston Churchill's dream became a reality. And the law was changed to say, in New Hampshire, we're going to have a chance to vote for someone who might be president, rather than just for the delegates that would go to a convention. We're going to vote for the candidate to be president. And that was the only state in the Union where that was introduced. New Hampshire was first. And it changed the nature of how people came to see politics in New Hampshire. People came here because they said, how do we do this? In fact, one sitting president was trying to figure out, what does it mean? And his name was Truman. And he was a sitting president. And the first election where the real election was going to be about picking a president, he had to decide whether or not to run for president. He was the sitting president. And Estes Kefauver also was saying, you know, I'm a senator, I think I'm ready to be president. So it was 1952, and the election to pick the nominees was the first time that a sitting president said, "I'm running," and then did run and lost in New Hampshire to Estes Kefauver. And Estes Kefauver was shocked that he won, and Harry S. Truman said, "I never said I was going to run." I didn't run. Oh, you did. But New Hampshire picked somebody else. And that was the seeds of the first in the nation primary. It changed the nature of democracy because other states said, we're going to have our citizens vote for the candidates too, not just for the delegates to go to a convention, but for the candidates that the conventions might consider. This is a controversial debate even today. You know that New Hampshire is being asked to not be first. Can you imagine anybody being asked, please fight for second place? New Hampshire doesn't like to be second when they know they're first. And you had a fabulous Secretary of State, a Democrat, who was Secretary of State for a long time, the longest serving Secretary of State in the country at the time when he resigned. And he said, I'm going to protect the first in the nation primaries. And he was very highly regarded. I actually met him when he was a state rep. I was a state rep in Massachusetts. I thought that was a big deal. He thought being a state rep in New Hampshire was a big deal. We were both right. But the first in the nation primary this year is gearing up so that it's only one side, or at least there's a question about at least one side. And I'm going to tell you my view of what's going on in politics today. Our democracy is very tarnished. I don't know how many of you wake up in the morning and say, I am so proud of that bureaucracy. How many of you say, I hope my grandson grows up to be a politician? I want my daughter to have a chance to be president of the United States. I don't know. I know that my grandmother actually did say, I hope that you'll get involved in politics. And she was that militant suffragette who fought for women to get the right to vote. But she had something that haunted me in my childhood, and I was very close to my grandmother. The rule was my grandmother lived across the street from me. So whenever I didn't do my homework, I was sent to Grandma's house. Whenever I misbehaved at home, I was sent to Grandma's house. I spent a lot of time at Grandma's house. And she'd sit at the dining room table to eat a meal, and before we could sit down, we had to offer a blessing. We gave the blessing, then we sat down, and we weren't allowed to pick up an eating utensil until we responded to my grandmother, who would say, tell me something from the newspaper today. I'm sure it was the Globe. And if you could say anything. I was really good at saying, the Red Sox won. But eventually, every conversation turned into something about politics. What's the school committee doing? What are the selectmen doing? What's the state rep doing? Who is the state senator? What's the county commissioner doing? What's the president doing? What's Congress doing? What's happening at the State Department? Almost every conversation turned into something to do with politics. And my grandmother loved it. And she wouldn't let us agree. If we agreed with what somebody else said, she would say, democracy is not that easy. Find out what they really believe. There's got to be another view. If it's your view all the time, chances are you're wrong most of the time. So I grew up to learn about what other people thought, to invite them to be part of it. I like to say when I grew up, the rug of American politics had more rug than fringe. Today, it has more fringe than rug. The truth is that thread that comes out at the far left is the same thread that comes out at the far right. And it goes right through the middle of the rug. But I learned you can't govern unless you give permission to stand on the rug. Bring the wisdom of the right and the wisdom of the left and find common good in a solution. We don't do that today. So I grew up so that the word politics was not a dirty word. It was a noble invitation. And when you think about it, the document that you celebrated this past week started with the word when. When in the course of human events. And we talk about those events. In fact, we saw a king get sworn in this year and demand allegiance from everybody. Can you imagine what our founding fathers would be saying if we said, wow, that is so cool, he wants everybody to pledge allegiance to him? That Declaration of Independence said, no. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary to have a democracy and a voice. And the words were carefully chosen in that document, and no one word really stood out until you got to the names. And then the egos took over. John Hancock! And others signed the document. And that John Hancock became an insurance company. I don't know if there's any royalties to it. But it was a remarkable document with carefully selected words. But there were brave people who signed it. Brave people who sometimes gave up everything because they signed it. And then we went to war. And that's when this building was being built. And as it was being topped off, they heard the cannon fire from Breed's Hill, Battle of Bunker Hill. And they sent the runners down to find out what's going on, and the runners came back. And the town crier cried and said, we're sending our troops in to fight. And right out there in that cemetery are tombstones from people who fought at Bunker Hill. Their names were not written in big letters. It didn't say John Hancock. Instead, we honor them for fighting for us. And then there's another document. And boy, the words were even harder to agree to. And teams of people got together and fractured each other, argued about words, and words really matter. And they wrote a document that was remarkable. And what was most remarkable is the very first word is what? We. We. The biggest word that pops out at you is a two-letter word. And it's our Constitution. And the we is an inclusive word, but at the time, it was not all inclusive. But it was a wonderful invitation, and we paid attention. And guess what? People came to Jaffrey and read that Constitution, probably in this building, and hung on every word. And the Keene Sentinel, I don't know if they covered it or not, but it was printed and printed and printed and debated, and the words were spectacular. They just didn't go far enough in some places. The we was not as inclusive as we know it is today, but it was a remarkable document. But the document itself is remarkable because it gives us all rights and privileges. It doesn't give us any obligation unless we accept the invitation to be part of the solution. That's politics. We're not obligated to register to vote. We're invited to register to vote. We're not obligated to vote. We're invited to vote. We're not obligated to run for selectmen. We invite ourselves to do that, and we pretend that others asked us to. And we all get together and we say, we're going to send a team to Concord and be part of that miraculous entity called the New Hampshire House of Representatives. You think it's like having a house of 13 little babies. It's a dynamic place. And every single member of that house is overcompensated. Oh, no, they're not. They don't make hardly anything. But they bring your voice to the debate, and they make a difference. But guess what? You're only invited to vote for them. You don't have to vote for them. You're only invited to be a member of that body. You're not obligated to it. You accept the invitation. And that invitation in our Constitution is the invitation that people all over the world want. The National Endowment for Democracy's job is to plant seeds of democracy around the world and fertilize them and water them and have them produce results where the people there can be part of the government so that they have a we. This is our government, and where is our pride? Winston Churchill from New Hampshire, that's what his call for us was to be, involved. Be involved and be relevant. Don't be on the sidelines. Be involved and be relevant. So today, our democracy is pretty tarnished. And the words that are used aren't carefully understood, thought about as they're used. In fact, we don't spend hardly any time thinking about our words. Instead, we want to be first with them, and we lick our thumbs and tweet them out. We don't think about the words that we're saying, but we put them out there, and we can never get them back. So it used to be, if you were a journalist, you had to learn the discipline of journalism. And you had to learn to listen objectively to someone who is telling you what they want to tell you, challenge their intellect, their truth, and their bias, write about it, and share it with an editor, and demonstrate to the editor that the words that you use were well-grounded because you had confidence in your source, and therefore you could use the words. And the editor might say, get rid of the adjectives and get rid of the adverbs. Just use nouns and verbs. And let the reader find the emotion rather than you give them your emotion. Today, journalism doesn't have that discipline. I don't even know if there are editors today. I don't even know if anyone argues about, can I have 2 column inches or can I have only 1? I'd like 15. And could I be on page 1? I don't want to be on the op-ed page. I want to be on the news page. But what you said belongs on the op-ed page. It goes to the op-ed page. Is that discipline there? So our founding fathers, who did not always agree, did agree that words mattered. They took the time to analyze every word. If you read the debate over the debate about our Constitution, you will find that they spent a lot of time arguing over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words. And some people got really angry and actually said, I'm leaving the meeting. And they'd have to go next door and say, come back to the meeting. And the only founding father that signed every relevant document that we have in the establishment of our great country was Ben Franklin. And he was the character of all characters. But he cared about the words. And I remember when the Constitution came up for a vote, he said, "I'm not sure I agree with everything in this. But I know that every word that went into it was well discussed, and I can support it. I don't have to have my way. I'm comfortable with the way that you got it done." And Ben Franklin knew he shouldn't be part of government. He just helped set it up because he knew he couldn't trust his own ego. It's a fact. But he understood that the value of the Constitution is the fact that it is an invitation. You should never be bullied into voting. You should never be bullied into running for office. Although your ego might like that if it happened. Please bully me, because I'd like to be governor. But words make a difference. So in this time where New Hampshire is struggling to maintain its preeminent role in helping to pick a president, you like it that candidates to be president of the United States think they must campaign in New Hampshire. The road to the White House, when I was at Franklin Pierce University, I said, I want to make sure that the road to the White House goes through Franklin Pierce. And at the time, I think there were like 14 candidates running for president, and I invited every one of them to come to the campus, and most of them did. And I wanted the road to the White House to go right through Franklin Pierce. We needed a bigger venue for some of those people that showed up. How many of you came to any events when those candidates came to Franklin Pierce? I know, I've seen a few faces that I know were there. But we filled the field house for Bernie Sanders, but we included far right, far left, in the middle, lost, troubled, wandering. They were all welcome. And you want that to be the case. Why? Because I want you to be infectious with the democracy that was given to us by the Constitution. I want you to be infected. I want you to be contagious so that other people will say, if you're voting, I'm voting. If you're running for office, I'm thinking about running for office. I'll tell you what, I'll bring the rug and you can tell me where the fringe is. And I could say, you're already standing on it. I am not. The other thing I would say is, today, dialogue is very important. This sounds like an oxymoron, and by the way, I am a living oxymoron. I'm an engineer by training and a politician by disease. I didn't know if you were an engineer and a politician that you're an oxymoron, because there are very few engineers in politics. Thankfully, you've got a governor who is an engineer and a governor, and he's really a good leader. But I'm telling you that it is time for us to say, we are the ones who are responsible for this government. Not somebody else, we are. Candidates make a difference, but we empower them. Where is your courage to stand up and say, I'm registering to vote, I'm going to vote, I'm going to support, I'm going to oppose, I'm going to debate, I'm going to participate? When will you stand up and do it? That's the strength. Final thing I'll say is that our democracy has been under attack many times. In fact, the Winston Churchill from Cornish, New Hampshire, was quite controversial in his day because he said, basically, a group of people should not be empowered to make the decisions for me. You should let me vote for the decisions that are needed for our government. I want to vote for the candidates, not just for the smoke-filled rooms where you're going to go decide what happens. And that was controversial. But we, right now, are giving up some of our rights to participate when we crowd out other people's rights to participate. So this is not a zero-sum game. If you get into politics to think it's my way or the highway, you shouldn't be on the road. There isn't one. You already know I parked the car in Harvard Yard from Massachusetts. I met my wife in the 5th grade. There are no secrets. She knows it when I'm embellishing, and she'll tell me when I get home. But the truth is, I lived in Holbrook, Massachusetts. And I graduated from college with a degree in engineering from the University of South Carolina on a Navy ROTC scholarship. And I did some time on a ship, and I got married, and I came back to Holbrook, Massachusetts, and literally, I graduated as an engineer, I went to work as an engineer, but I decided I was going to run for office. And I ran for the planning board in Holbrook, Massachusetts. 5-year term, curb cuts, cul-de-sacs, great experience, no pay, Thursday nights, 7 to 9, that usually turned 7 to 10, and a lot of fun. Then the Permanent School Building Committee, which is always permanent but never building. And then I ran for state representative. And I remember I told my dad, I said, I think I'm going to run for state representative. And he said to me, as a Republican? I said, yes. And he said, this is an overwhelmingly Democratic district. It's 6-1 Democrat. He said, are you sure you want to run? I said, I am. This is what I believe in. And my dad didn't discourage me. He was active in the political, he was moderator of the town, he was on the school committee for a long time. My grandmother was gung-ho, go get him. My wife was supportive, my kids were supportive. My wife is my conscience and would always take me in a direction that I didn't think I should go in, but she was always right once I got to the place. And I was very grateful for that. But I ran for state representative, and I remember people telling me I couldn't win. And I didn't have any money. And so I did grassroots campaigning like you do in New Hampshire. I went door to door. I wrote notes to people. I campaigned before I went to work in the morning as an engineer, and before I went home after being an engineer, I knocked on doors. Knocked on my opponent's door every night. He was always at home, which I was glad to see, which meant he wasn't campaigning. He was a big Democrat, had been there for a long time, and I was so polite to him. I said, it's so good to see you. And he said, oh, you're a hard-working, you're a good hard-working kid. And I said, just remember, I'm not running against you. I'm just running for the same seat you're running for. Oh, you're a good kid. Okay, good enough. I get to know his family really, really well, and I got 67% of the vote. I was the only Republican in New England, this is not hyperbole, I was the only Republican in New England in 1974 that defeated an incumbent Democrat for any office. Why? Because I knocked on doors. Because I had empathy. I guarantee out of all the doors I knocked on, probably my door would have been the easiest one to break into. And they would be able to steal nothing but hard work. And then I served in the legislature, and I became the Republican whip after one term in the Massachusetts House. That's because there were no Republicans to whip in the Massachusetts House. But I'm pleading with you, please help polish our democracy. Please help register to vote, get other people to register to vote, to make sound decisions. I'm going to do something quite controversial right now, and I'm going to finish. And I didn't want to do it in such a way that I misspoke, because the words do make a difference. January 6th troubled me. And I'm not questioning anybody else's bias, but I was very troubled by what happened on January 6th. I had tears in my eyes. It was very troubling. And then I came to find something published July 26th, 1920, in the Baltimore Evening Sun. And this was a time when democracy in America was being challenged, and there was socialism was part of the debate, and there were lots of things going on, and a reporter by the name of H.L. Mencken, a very famous, not a reporter, he was an opinion writer. And this is what he wrote on July 26, 1920. Listen to the words. As democracy is perfected, the office of the president represents more and more closely the inner soul of the people. On some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire at last, and the White House will be occupied by a downright fool and a complete narcissistic moron. I don't like those words, but I do think they define what has happened. So this column, this report, 100 years ago, 103 years ago, almost to the day, actually defines what is happening in democracy today. We are the people. H.L. Mencken was not. Our candidates are not. We are the people. Problems with leadership are generated by the we, not necessarily the leaders. The leaders can't help themselves. The word narcissism doesn't exist in our Constitution. The word Republican does not exist in the Constitution. The word Democrat does not exist in the Constitution. The word republic does. Democracy does. But we, the people, are the ones that give definition to Republican and Democrat. And our definition should be one that polishes democracy rather than tarnishes it, is inclusive rather than exclusive, because the world is watching. One of the responsibilities as a chief of staff is to have peripheral vision. The vast majority of people who serve a president are hired because they have expertise and phenomenal tunnel vision. A chief of staff's job is to acknowledge those with excellent tunnel vision, but have peripheral vision to see how it will be understood, respected, and resulting. So my peripheral vision says that we can be doing a better job than we are doing. The tunnel vision says, you're the one to do it. 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 That's what makes a great democracy. Every fledgling democracy is paying attention to what's happening in this country right now. And autocrats are taking advantage of what they see are the challenges in our democracy. And frequently, they are feeding those challenges. They are reinforcing the challenges of the world. And we, the people, have to stand up and say, enough's enough. We're in it together. And with that, I'd be glad to stop talking and try to respond to your question. Do not be bashful about it, asking me a question. I'll try to answer it succinctly, but you can even be angry with me. It's okay. So why don't we open it up? I know it, yes, right over there, first question.
I'm from New Hampshire, although I now live in Florida. Sorry about that.
We're sorry too.
I served the legislature up here, and I'm just wondering about the momentum that Bush #2 after the Florida recount, where it took all that time to settle that issue before people could be appointed to government.
Sure, the question is basically after the hanging chads in Florida, okay, after the hanging chads in Florida, why did it take so long for the Bush administration to be able to put together a team to lead? And one of the shortest transitions, well, obviously, you know, there were short transitions when presidents died and vice presidents had to step into the role right away. But the Supreme Court picked George Bush to be president of the United States, George W. Bush. And that did not happen until, I think it was December 15th. And so our formal transition into office didn't start until he was confirmed the winner by the Supreme Court. But we had done a lot of work in building a team. So I can tell you that all but one member of the cabinet was pretty well identified before December 15th. And we had done I ran the transition out of government for the first President Bush when Bill Clinton came in. And I was I led the White House side of the transition into government for George H.W. Bush to building the White House staff. So we had a good team going. We actually got everybody confirmed right off the bat. We had one challenge, maybe you remember, with George H.W. Bush with the Secretary of Defense. But other than that, for George W. Bush, we had success with all of our nominees to be in the cabinet and got them in seats pretty efficiently. The remarkable thing about transitions is you don't get to change the date you take the oath of office. So at noontime on January 20th, you're taking the oath whether you're ready or not, and by definition, you're supposed to be ready. Can you imagine having a president say, I'm taking the oath, but I'm not quite ready yet? It's even worse when they say, follow me, and things will get worse. So optimism is important, and you have to lead with optimism if you're going to expect results to make a difference. Yes?
I thought you were going to talk about how precarious our democracy seems to be, but you didn't even touch peripherally on that.
On the what?
How precarious the state of our democracy seems to be, but you didn't even touch peripherally on that topic.
I think it's precarious. I think the fringe, there are more people standing on the fringe than there's room to be standing on the fringe. There's much more room in the middle of that rug, and that's where people have to go. If it's your way or the highway, you're being selfish to probably 60% of your constituency. Just remember, if you're a member of Congress, you represent everyone in that district, not just the people who represent your label. You represent everybody. So my view is that there has to be a conscience for those who feel, I only represent the people who voted for me, or I only represent the people who stand on my side of the rug. No, you have an obligation to represent everyone, even the people who didn't vote. That doesn't mean you have to reflect their vote, but you have to listen to them. You have to try to develop some empathy, or you try to lead them and say, this is why I'm doing it. I know you don't agree with me, but this is why I'm doing it. I think we want our politicians who are serving in office to recognize they have a responsibility beyond the primary voter in an election. The general election is when the final decision is made on who represents a district. And I'm not saying you have to change your values. But if you've got good values, you also should feel comfortable explaining them. This is why I believe in what I believe. Look, I'm a Republican. I remember going to Franklin Pierce and meeting with the faculty for the very first time, and some of the faculty members are here. I walked in and they, who are you? And they looked at me and said, George W. Bush, we hate him. Or, you're a Republican, we hate Republicans. And I said, you don't know me. All I know is you're a professor. And I can't have a university without a professor. I need you. You know a student is failing before they know they're failing, and I need to know that they're failing so I can save them. But I'm not saying you have to like the people who represent you, but you should demand equal time if they're not letting you have your views. And I think it's important to demonstrate empathy. And you should demonstrate empathy for those who have to make tough decisions. Politicians frequently have to make tough decisions, especially executives, governors, and presidents. I've watched President Bush, President Reagan, and President Bush make brutally tough decisions. It's really, really, really hard, and you ache for them. And there's no tougher decision than making a decision to send young men and women into harm's way. And that burden does not leave when they leave the presidency. And just remember that. If you're an executive in the political world, you are making tough decisions, and there are consequences. And the empathy that you have as a legislator or a president should be reflected in how you represent. That doesn't mean you have to change your views. It just means that you have to be open to hearing other views. So I don't know if I answered your question. Question up here.
Yeah, you talked about the importance of our primaries for people to elect their representatives. But in the federal election, it's the Electoral College that does it, and we've had several elections recently in which the popular vote did not elect the president. Is that a democratic method?
The debate over the Electoral College, yes, that's some of the debate over the Electoral College. The real part of the debate over the Electoral College is how did the Constitution create the Electoral College? They did it because big states would dominate if you didn't have the Electoral College system. If you just did the popular vote, New York, California, Texas, and Florida would pick every president. New Hampshire would be an also-ran. By having an Electoral College, the goal of our founding fathers was to say we're going to balance it. So it's not just the big population centers that will determine who the leadership is. But it's controversial. It should be controversial, and we should talk about it. But I think it'd be very hard to change it. And I think the unintended consequences frequently show up much more frequently than we realize. And the Montanas, Wyomings, and Alaskas of the world would feel very disenfranchised if they had basically no vote for president or no vote for some of these other offices.
Thank you.
Okay. Over here, right here.
Andy, talking about the fringes, my question is, on the extreme left, going that way, away from the Democratic Party, on the extreme right, the Republican Party is basically disappearing. Do you see real Democratic Party and real Republican Party coming back to the front?
One of the challenges with the people who wrote the Constitution, they wrote it without any expectation of partisan politics. They didn't say there will be two parties. We stumbled into a multi-party system that ended up being groomed into a two-party system, and there were many fits and starts. The Whigs, so our democracy is different than parliamentary democracies around the world, where they have multiple parties and sometimes multiple parties represented in their ministries and in their parliaments. And we don't have that. Canada does, most of Europe does, but we have a two-party system that has evolved this way. I think it would be hard to undo it. I know there's a group called No Labels. And I have great respect for the people who are involved in it. I just think their end game is not well defined yet. And I think there may be unintended consequences to the game because they haven't gamed it enough to see where are the consequences. But the two-party system we stumbled into, I think it works relatively well to have a two-party system. I think it would be very hard to have a multi-party system where with a brokered house, it's hard enough to have a brokered house right now. It would be much tougher if you had like 15 members of this party, 15 members of that party, 20 members of another party, and then Republicans and Democrats, and you were always trying to build coalitions. Parliamentary systems are different because the executive responsibility also rests with the ministers and the members of the parliament. So it's a different system. When I was young and naive, I said, why don't we do it the way the Canadians do it? I love the Canadians. And then I said, because it doesn't work. And I talked with some of the Canadian prime ministers, and they said, your system is much better than our system. But they won't say that publicly, but I can tell you that's what they've said. Yes?
Thank you so much. if you go back, Abraham Lincoln talked about better angels. And then John Meacham wrote the book saying we've been through times like this before. My question for you is, when you look to the past, who are the better angels? Who are the people who you look at and say we can trust with our people?
They're there. No, no, the question is, where are the better angels when I go to Washington, D.C.? Where are the sane people? Maybe that's it. Where are the sane people? And look at, Ted Kennedy was like a mortal enemy to the Republican Party when I was serving as chief of staff. You can expect that. And this is a little bit of an inside story. I hope I don't get in trouble. But anyway, I remember being with, this is very early in the administration, probably the first 3 weeks. And I'm with President Bush, his first visit to Camp David. And pick up the, chief of staff, you get up very early in the morning. You have a ton of reading to do. You have lots of paperwork to do. Nothing goes on the president's desk that you haven't read, so you've got to read all that stuff. And then I go down to see him in Aspen, the main building there, and I'm sitting with them, and he's saying, "Did you read the New York Times today?" I said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Did you see that article of Ted Kennedy saying terrible things about me?" I said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Well, what do you think about it?" "He's your friend." He throws the paper down at me. And I read the article again, and I said, he doesn't mean it. He doesn't mean it. That's not the Ted Kennedy I know. He said, "Well, there it is, black and white, right there." And he said, "What are you going to do about it?" I said, "I'm going to call him up." So I called up Senator Kennedy, and I got him. I said, "Senator, I read the New York Times this morning, and I think you went a little bit overboard. It wasn't the Ted Kennedy that I know." He said, "Absolutely, I stand by every word that I said." I said, "Just go back and read it again and tell me that you think that it was the right thing to do." He said, "You're telling me to read it?" I said, "I'm just suggesting that you read it." And then he hangs the phone up. And I'm talking to the president. He said, "Well, that was a short conversation. What did you say?" And the phone rings, and it's Ted Kennedy. He says, "I read the article. Yeah, I kind of went overboard. I apologize." I said, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" He says, I'll remember this. I'll remember this. I'll remember this." Keep in touch. Keeping in touch makes a difference. Where was Laura Bush on 9/11? She was in Ted Kennedy's office. So, and I'll tell you one of them. We just went through a debt ceiling debate. Remember the debate over the debt ceiling? And you always have to allow the debt ceiling to go up. But every year, there's a big challenge not to happen, because the consequences of not increasing the debt ceiling or reneging on our debt are dramatic and very disruptive to global economy. And I remember it was very close vote. It happened to be March of 2006. And it was late at night, and the head of legislative affairs came into my office, and I was still there like 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, and said, "I just talked to Mitch McConnell. He says we're 2 votes short. We can't get the votes to get the debt ceiling increased." And James DePaul knows this story because I told it to him before, right back there. And I called up Senator McConnell, and I said, "I understand you're 2 votes short." "Yes, we are," and he wanted more from the White House. This is always the give and take of politics. And I said, "What am I going to do?" So I took out my records, and I found out that Ted Kennedy had voted like 35 times on the debt ceiling. Never voted against it when it didn't pass. He knew that you had to pass it. He voted for it as many times as he voted against it, but it always passed. And I said, "Senator, I got your record." He said, "You did all that?" And I said, "Yes, I did." I said, "You know where we are." And Mitch McConnell tells me he's 2 votes shy. I'd love to be able to say to him, "I've got a vote for you." And he says, "Tell you what, you're a good guy, you're playing it straight with me, I'll give you a vote." I said, do you remember that I said we're 2 votes shy? And he said, okay, very astute, very astute. And I went down the list of senators. And I'm going to say this, please. No, I'm not going to say it because I'll get in trouble. I said one name of a senator, and he said, don't waste your time on him. He's not interested in being part of a solution. But then I said, what about Chris Dodd from Connecticut? And Ted Kennedy, was Ted Kennedy's best friend in the Senate. And he said, call Senator Dodd up, give me 15 minutes, and then you call Senator Dodd. And I said, thank you. I waited 15 minutes, I called Senator Dodd, and I said, Senator Dodd, Mitch McConnell says we're 2 votes shy. I get 1 vote from Ted Kennedy. I'd love to be able to say we've found another vote. And he said, Ted called me, I'll be with you on it. So I could call up Senator McConnell very late at night, like 11:30 at night, and say, you're 2 votes shy. He said, yes, we're 2 votes shy, and we need to get this, and I want this, and I want that, and I want that. I said, you're 2 votes shy? And he said, yes, we're 2 votes shy, can't get 2 votes. I said, I've got 2 votes for you. And he says, how did you get 2 votes? I said, I got them from the other side of the aisle. And he slammed the phone down. He slammed the phone down. I went home. It was well after midnight. Got back to my office at 5:30 the next morning. The president comes into the Oval Office around 7 o'clock, and I said, we've got the votes on the debt ceiling. And he says, oh, great, good, let's go. I go back to my office. Mitch McConnell is calling me, and all he says is, I don't need your damn votes. And I could call Ted Kennedy and Chris Dodd and release them. That's how democracy works. And you have to allow it to work that way. Yeah.
All great stories, but at a time when we're all looking for people who are sort of anti-card types who are in the middle of the game, right? Who are the people you look up to that we should look up to?
Sure.
I know it's a hard question.
No, well, people make a difference. And if you work at the White House, there's one big challenge that you have if you work at the White House, and that's getting in the door. It's not staying there, okay? Getting in the door is hard, because there are a lot of competent people, they all want to work at the White House, but it's hard to get in there. Especially when you need top security clearances and all that kind of stuff, it's hard. But people make a difference, and you have to have people that have the courage to speak truth to power. The role of a chief of staff, I wanted to be the chief of staff when nobody knew his name. I knew about Sherman Adams. I wasn't interested in being Sherman Adams. I knew John Sununu. I wasn't interested in being John Sununu. I just wanted to be Andy Card, some guy who works in Washington, D.C., who happened to be the chief of staff. Because I knew the real superstars were Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney. That's what I wanted to focus on. And so I was looking to be relatively invisible until that picture was taken of me whispering in the president's ear in that classroom in Sarasota, Florida, which is a whole nother story. But people make a difference. Condoleezza Rice is a rock star. She's a rock star today. She was a rock star yesterday and the 100,000 days before that. She's a rock star. Colin Powell definitely had the courage to speak truth to power, and he did it in such a way that it was respectful. Dick Cheney, contrary to the myth, was very, very good. He had great empathy for me. So did Don Rumsfeld. They had both been chiefs of staff, so they would call me up and say, you've got the worst job in the world, I know it, but I'm going to make it a little worse today. You know, thanks for the help, you know. But having people that you can trust and allowing people to express their views, part of the job of a chief of staff, the responsibilities are the care and feeding of the president, policy formulation, and marketing and selling. That's the job of a chief of staff. Care and feeding is by far the greatest responsibility. The president must be in a position to make a tough decision at any time, on any day, in any venue. So 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, I focused on the president's mental health, emotional health, spiritual health, and his physical health. And I paid attention to when his bags got lost on Air Force One or what, I didn't want any problems. You all want to be president. You're very well cared for. And then that's the hardest part of the job, and nobody knows about it. The next part of the job is policy formulation, and that's the job you all think is the biggest part of the job. And it's really just managing the personalities that help the president make policy. Most people who work at the White House are the best and the brightest in what they do. Unfortunately, they all know that they're best and the brightest. So my job would be to make sure the oversized ego didn't crowd out other good counsel. So I would be a broker in the process. Mr. President, I know Sally said this, she was very powerful, but Sammy has something else to say that you didn't get to hear because Sally just nominated the whole time. Oh, what should I do about it? I said, call up Sammy and find out what she has to say. So that's the policy formulation. But yes, the president would ask me for my views, and yes, I would give him my views, and I was unvarnished. Ronald Reagan was like my grandfather. That was harder to talk to him tough like. George H.W. Bush was like my dad, and whenever I talked tough to him, I apologized to him 10 times afterwards. George W. Bush was like my brother, and I could say, "You're an idiot!" And he'd say, "No, you're an idiot." I said, "Why did you do that?" "No, why did you do that?" So very different, but that's the way it works. But people make a difference. The courage to speak truth to power and not to bully other people from offering advice and counsel. You do not want monolithic thinking in the West Wing of the White House. If there's monolithic thinking in the West Wing of the White House and the president is involved, the president is wasting his or her time. And time is the only thing you have no control over. Don't waste the president's time with a non-presidential decision. There can be other people in government making government decisions. The president will own every decision that's made in the government, but the president should only be making presidential decisions. I've overstayed my welcome. The standing hook is right there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you. Go get cookies and milk or whatever we're going to have, and I'd love to talk with you. Obviously, I love sharing my experiences and my stories, but I'm pleading with you to have a little bit of a guilty conscience if you're not part of the we. Okay? Thank you.
As is our tradition, I'd like to present Andy with a half gallon of our maple syrup and say thank you. Thanks very much. That was great. So I hope to see you next week. Our speaker will be Andy Davis. He's a great storyteller. You may have seen him here last year introducing another speaker. Hope to see you next week. I know that it's going to be nice weather and a little cooler. So please join us next door at the reception.
Ring the bell.
You're right. You can go now.